This introductory video reviews our screens and the intro lecture for the Romantic Age introduction. This is our Unit 5 in our textbook. You notice on the first screen the Romantic era has two beginning dates because most literature books begin this period in 1798. That's when Wordsworth and Coleridge, two very important Romantic Age writers, came out with a book of poetry called Lyrical Ballads of 1798 that really started to reshape the idea of what poetry should be. Most history books, though, go back a few more years than that to a very famous event in 1789, the French Revolution. And certainly this is a time of great revolutions happening in the world. The time period ends in 1832. Sir Walter Scott, a famous writer, died that year, but also the passage of the first Reform Bill that started giving people more rights. It's kind of nebulous when the unit ends because many of our Romantic Age writers and painters continued working throughout the next time period, the Victorian Age as well. But to separate those two units, usually we pick the early 1800s as a time, around 1832, 1836, time to end the Romantic era. So toward the end of the 1700s and the first few decades of the 1800s, we'll call that the Romantic period. All right? So we know there was revolution in the air. Of course, we had a revolution. Now, the British usually don't include us in the list of people having a revolution because we had a revolution against them. So they kind of look that over. But to us, it's very important. But the French Revolution is the one that a lot of people use to begin this time period. The French executed their king, Louis XVI. But unfortunately, the French put the dictator Napoleon in power. They gave him unlimited power, which is never a very wise idea. What started as a hope for democracy became for them a dictatorship. And Napoleon was not satisfied only with France. He wanted more territory as well. So France and England broke their treaties and prepared for war. And then in 1705, of course, Napoleon's ships engaged Lord Nelson's British fleet. The Battle of Trafalgar is a very famous battle that ended some hours later with the French line weakened but no British ship lost. However, their great leader, Lord Nelson, Admiral Lord Nelson, was killed by a sniper's bullet. Another conflict with the French in this series of Napoleonic wars was in 1815 with the great English commander Wellington defeating Napoleon at the Battle of Waterloo. But even then, conflicts continue. They continue to fight until 1822, ending with the Congress of Vienna, which gave Britain many French landholdings around the world. Now, why is that important to us? It's important to us because when Britain was awarded a lot of Caribbean lands and African countries and many other places that France had once controlled, the British soldiers moved into those areas all around the country. And what did they take with them? They took the English language. And the British weren't about to learn anybody else's language, so they demanded that all these other people learn English. English starts becoming truly a world language at this point. Well, here's a screen that shows our royals. Very easy. It's George III that we fought against in the American Revolutionary War and his two children, George IV and William IV. Poor George III, he not only lost the American colonies, but as he got older, he went blind and even insane. So his son, who became the future George IV, ruled as what we call a prince regent, and eventually, when his father died, became King George IV. George IV had been a very extravagant prince. He, against their law, had married a Catholic. Parliament dissolved that marriage and arranged marriage to one of his cousins instead. His rule is marked, though, by the Catholic Emancipation Act, which freed Catholic political prisoners and allowed Catholics to run for Parliament, which they had not been able to do for a long time. George IV was succeeded by his brother, who by this time was quite old. He was known as the Sailor King, William IV. He had a common law wife who had had 10 of his children, but Parliament would not recognize any of those children to take over. He was a very popular king. They liked the old man as a king, but Parliament became very, very strong under his rule because as a person in the military and the Navy, he really hadn't cared much about politics and really had not prepared himself to run the country. So Parliament became much stronger. The different groups in Parliament picked a coalition prime minister that they both could work with, and that's Charles Grey. Many reforms happened under Grey. Slavery was abolished in the British colonies. Money was paid to the former slave owners to keep their plantations going. Factory acts were passed that helped to limit women and children's work hours. Canada was united under one government overseen by the British. And Hong Kong was an Asian city annexed to become a major import-export hub for the British. And of course, the British built Hong Kong into a metropolis. That deal ended, though, in 1997, and Britain had to return their big metropolis that they had created over to the now communist Chinese government. But the people of Hong Kong are still very independent-minded. And the people of Hong Kong have often resisted many of the laws that Beijing has tried to put into place. They still have that independent spirit that they had when they were British citizens. After William IV died, the throne went to his niece Victoria. Now you remember, these people were all really German heritage. And they had held on to a lot of their German land, but the German land could not be passed to a female. And so Victoria became Queen of England, but she lost the German land that her family had controlled. But she was so powerful a woman, she controlled those who were still on that land, as well as marrying many of her children and her grandchildren to royals all over the planet, so she could keep a strong hold on what was going on planet Earth. That's another unit coming up after a while. But that's the transition that we will see later on. So let's talk about Romanticism a little bit. It is a time of rebellion, it's a time of revolution, but a time, literarily, of great imagination and freedom. We might say artistically, it's a time of imagination and freedom, either in painting or in writing. They did not have the term Romantic Age. That was applied about 50 years later by historians. They simply called it the spirit of the age. It's a short time period. Some of our units we've had were hundreds of years long. This one's just a few decades long, like 3 decades. And yet so much writing was done. So many changes were occurring on planet Earth. We give it its own unit and call it the Romantic Era. Romantic, of course, harkens back to the old medieval view of romance, which meant really an adventure story of the knights. The stories of Charlemagne, the stories of King Arthur, those were called medieval romances. The modern idea of a love story mixed in kind of got started in the Middle Ages, because many times the knights would go out on their adventures to impress a lady that they were in love with. But at this time, romantic means emphasis on the imagination, on rebellion, on revolution, on freedom. In 1798, Wordsworth and his literary partner, Samuel Taylor Coleridge, put out a book called Lyrical Ballads of 1798. Many of the poems in there were standard poems. There were plenty of sonnets, that would have looked as if they'd come from any other time period. But occasionally, especially the first one, Rime of the Ancient Mariner by Coleridge, very strange poetry, very imaginative poetry, poetry unlike what people had written before. And plus, it also praised something that had been neglected up to this point. It praised the natural world. It praised nature. And they saw a connection of God and nature. And our connection with nature was our connection with God. And so some emphasize that more than others did, but that's a theme that they had that really hadn't been explored before this time period. Some of the major characteristics of Romanticism are sentimentalism. They weren't afraid to show emotion in their writing. Imagination over reason. Now, back in their previous unit, the 17th and 18th century unit, those people believed in reason, in logic. These people believe in imagination. A renewed interest in Shakespeare and the Bible. Glorification of the commonplace. So they could write about something magnificent, or they could write about a simple animal in the field. Supernatural themes. Belief in the brotherhood and sisterhood of humanity. A reaction against the more strict aspects of neoclassicism. They were interested in defining poetry. The most famous definition probably comes from Wordsworth. All good poetry, he said, is the spontaneous overflow of powerful feelings. So the emphasis was on feelings, not only the intellect, but the heart as well. They were very interested in folklore and mythology, and often based their poems on legends. They believed in poetic freedom. Now, they could write sonnets as well as anybody, those formal 14-line poems that we usually connect with the Renaissance, but they also explored other more radical forms of poetry. Of course, as I've said, they had a great love of nature. They were interested in the past and often glorified the past, writing about ancient China or ancient Egypt in their writings. They believed in personal and political freedom. These were free thinkers. And also, as we've also alluded to, they believed in finding the divine or finding God within the created world. When we think about our Romantics, many names come to mind. Our book does not include all of these, and as you know by now, our book often includes people of other time periods within the thematic unit. But within this time period, we think about some of the early Romantics like Gray or Miss Finch or Bobby Burns, the Scottish writer, or William Blake, the great visionary. Wordsworth and Coleridge, of course. Here's a picture of Wordsworth on the left, picture of Robert Burns on the right. One of our major figures in Romanticism. And then there's a break. And then there's a new generation, a younger group that comes up. And sometimes they're known as the young radicals, Byron, Shelley, and Keats. And all three of these, unlike their predecessors, died relatively young. Lord Byron died at age 36, helping Greek rebels who were trying to fight against Turkey for independence. Percy Shelley died in a boating accident at age 29. And John Keats, perhaps the most tragic of all, died at only the age of 25 of tuberculosis that had killed many, many members of his family. It's as if they were so creative that their creative juices just burned them out early. But all of these were very different writers. Shelley and Byron were very good friends, but they did not write alike. William Wordsworth liked John Keats, but he couldn't stand Shelley. He didn't like Shelley's politics. Shelley was a radical atheist and bragged about it. And that turned a lot of people off, including Wordsworth. But even Wordsworth had to say that of all of the Romantic poets, he believed that Shelley was still the best poet. Nowadays, people tend to put John Keats on the pedestal. Since he died so young, we always wonder, what could he have been? His early poetry is mostly imitation of other poets, but he was finding his voice when, unfortunately, he died of the TB that he killed both his mother and one of his brothers as well. So it's an interesting time period. It's a very short time period, but a lot happened in this time period, politically as well as literarily.